Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the May 2011 edition of the SangamonValley.net user group meeting. Our presentation tonight, I'm very excited about. I hope you are too. I see a lot of new faces tonight. That's a good thing. Appreciate y'all coming out. Hopefully you've taken advantage of the refreshments that Eller's Corporate has made available to us, the sodas and the cookies, and help yourselves. I mean, because my girlfriend will kill me if I eat all those. So, and of course, she didn't really come here to listen to me go on and on about cookies and presentation meetings and stuff. I mean, you're here tonight to hear an esteemed colleague of mine, and even though he may not say it, he definitely is an Entity Framework expert, Mr. Bruce Wright.
I wanted to sort of ask people, because I talked to some Horseman folks, and they have used Entity Framework quite a bit. In fact, they're using Entity Framework 4 right now. And I'm not sure, I kind of have a lot of topics I could cover tonight, and I would like to get some feedback from the audience as to what experience you already have with Entity Framework, so that'll help me decide how much weight to give all the different areas I could talk about. So maybe we could start with you guys and just kind of work around the room. You guys, no Entity Framework experience. All right?
4 months, 5 months, 6 months.
With 4, right? You were saying you've...
all of it's been 4 months.
Okay.
I've been using the code first stuff lately, just got getting into it.
So more just kind of not using it in a professional, not using it on a work app. And you two in the middle, no experience. Keith, Brandon, none. Limited.
Limited, but before I am, so.
Okay. What about that? You guys that said no Entity Framework, what about ORMs in general? Because that's something, I can talk about ORMs, I don't know.
I think there's some fundamentals.
Yeah, okay. All right. And then most of you guys back in the back there are Horseman folks, and you have used. So, I'm going to have to cover some basics at the beginning that's probably going to be repeats for you guys, but, A little background. There's too many people in this room that know me for me to lie about all my accomplishments, but I'll give you a little background on me for those that don't know me. I worked for LRS for 13 years. I worked on their Pension Gold product. I worked on their latest rev of the Pension Gold product. I also worked in their consulting division, and I worked with some of you in consulting projects back in the 90s. I did a web startup for a while. I was a CTO of a startup in the late 90s, early 2000s. And currently, I am a consultant working for Capital Strategies, and I'm at the State Retirement Systems. They hired me to come in. Basically, the State Retirement Systems is an interesting agency because they haven't done anything for the last 20 years, Rick? Is that safe to say? Their systems are as ancient as they could possibly be. People are writing on green bar. That's most of their systems are. Green bar gets printed, someone writes on it, and then another person key punches it in, or basically punch cards, or not. They didn't ditch those very long ago. So it's a great opportunity because we got to start from scratch and do completely new technology. And the other great thing about it is that almost no matter what we do, it's 100 times better than what they have. So we win no matter what. So anyway, I came in there it's been almost a year and a half ago, September a year ago. And at the time, Entity Framework 4 was being touted heavily, but it wasn't actually released yet. And so we had to decide, what are we going to base our data access strategy on? And I'll talk a little bit about ORMs for those that maybe haven't worked with them. ORM stands for Object Relational Manager. And the whole idea of an ORM is just it's a layer that helps you get from a relational database into objects, right? So you can work with them in an object-oriented fashion, right? And that's the nutshell description of what an ORM is, but that's a big subject, right? There's a lot to that. Some real specific areas that different ORMs have done differently is querying. How do you write queries in your programming language, or SQL or whatever? How do you write the queries to send to the database so that it can return the data? And then the second part of that chain is taking the data that's coming from the database, and I'm going to call it process hydration, where they get put into objects, where you take the data, the raw data coming out of SQL in tabular form, and load it into object-oriented objects in your programming language of choice. So that's a problem. Second, another area that comes up is you need to be able to do CRUD operations, right? You got to be able to create, update, delete records using objects, and that's not always natural. And there's been quite an evolution. The first ORM that really got widespread acceptance, I would say, was a product called Hibernate, and it was a Java system, an open source Java project, and it's still probably the most used ORM in the world. There's a .NET version of Hibernate called nHibernate that's also been around for quite a while and probably has the most penetration of any ORM product in the .NET space. So back to when I started at SRS, we spent a good amount of time looking at the ORMs that were out there, and Entity Framework and nHibernate quickly became the two that seemed to have the most potential. So the big thing that I looked at is that in the SRS infrastructure, or what's the word, environment, I knew that we were going to be doing something that had disconnected services, like a service, or I don't know if I want to call it a service-oriented architecture, but I knew that we were going to have, it wasn't going to be one monolithic application. We were going to have services running, and we were going to have software components talking across service boundaries. So I wanted to find an ORM that I felt would work the best in that scenario. Well, as it turns out, that's a problem that ORMs really haven't gotten very good at dealing with yet. And in fact, Entity Framework 4 is the first one that I know of that came out with an in-the-box solution for that. They call it self-tracking entities. And it's something that I definitely want to spend a lot of time on tonight, because I think the most value I can provide to you guys is to talk about what I'm actually working on, the things that we've learned. So back in the time when we were making this evaluation, we decided we needed to use self-tracking entities or something like that would help us work in an in-tier service-oriented environment. And that kind of made our decision for us. So we went to Entity Framework 4. So we've been working with it since before it came out, and still working on it today. So it's been about a year and a half. Mostly successful, with quite a few pitfalls and gotchas. So like I said, that's one of the things that I want to be sure to spend a decent amount of time on, is because I think that's something I can help you guys with. I'll tell you what kinds of things we've run into. But before I go there, let me start my slideshow. So as I said, it's the Microsoft of ORMs. And in typical Microsoft fashion, the first version sucked. I don't know if did anybody in here use 1.0 of Entity Framework? It was unusable. Ridiculous. And at the time, nHibernate was mature, nHibernate was a mature product, and Microsoft touts their version, comes out with it, and it was totally unusable. However, I'm calling it version 2 here because EF4 is really version 2 of their ORM, in my opinion. They did have a thing they called 1.5, but it was minor. In my opinion, 4 is really the second generation of the Microsoft ORM, and it has come a long way. It's a much better product. It is usable, and it does work, and for the most part we've been successful with it. And the other thing that's cool about it is, since they came out with 4, they have had a pretty active community around it. They've done CTPs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, community technology previews. They kind of do like beta releases, and they've done them. I mean, they've had like 5 of them, I think, since 4 came out. So, and they're still putting them out. I think the latest version of Entity Framework shipped maybe 3 weeks ago, 4.1, mid-April. Yeah. I'm going to use it tonight in all my demos. It's 4.1. And it does have some pretty good stuff in it, pretty substantial changes. So Microsoft seems to be pretty committed to it, which is, I think, an important thing for me to tell you guys, because you know how it is with Microsoft. They tend to, sometimes they come up with something and make it sound like the greatest thing in the world, and then a year later they're not supporting it anymore. Definitely not moving it forward. And so far, I don't see that happening with EF. It does seem like a technology that they're pretty committed to, and they seem to be to enhancing it. And then, as I mentioned in my sort of intro there's some unique stuff. It does have some features that are in EF that no other ORM has that I know of. And so the disconnected scenario, I think, is probably easier to achieve in EF than other ORMs. So with EF4, they introduced basically 3 different ways. I'm calling them modes. I'm not even sure what term they use for it. But there's 3 different paths you can take when you use EF in your system. You can either do database first, model first, or code first. Database first is mostly, I think, there for legacy systems. The idea is that you take a database that's already been engineered, that probably even has data in it, and you derive from that database a model that you can then use to translate into your C#, I'm saying C#, but your .NET code, right? It can be VB or C#. So the pros to an approach like that is that, like I said, it works with an existing system, so it's really useful for legacy. Are you guys doing database first? Is that what you guys are using? You're generating your models from the database? Yeah. And they have an existing system for the most part, so it makes sense. Another thing that is pretty cool about it, where I think you might want to use it even if it's not an existing system, is if you have a heavy investment in database modeling tools. At Pinch and Gold, we used to use a tool called Irwin, right? And so maybe some of you have heard of that. It's a good DB modeler. I mean, it's a modeling tool in and of itself, and in fact, its modeling is better than EF's model. So if you already know that tool or have a tool similar to that, and you're already invested in building models in that tool, go for it. And you can use database first, and you don't hopefully lose much of the investment that you've made in learning those tools. Downsides of that is that there's a lot of database structures that you're not able to capture in EF at this point. Some examples: table valued functions in SQL Server, something I like really well. No support in EF. Something they're talking about supporting but don't support yet. Even views to some degree. If you have a complicated view, the built-in translation from the database to your EF model can choke on them. So I've seen places like that where I was able to make it work, but I had to build my view. I had to basically build it in the EF model instead of being able to get it directly out of the database. So anyway, and there's some other things like constraints. Unique constraints, for example, no support in EF. You can do primary keys, but you cannot do unique constraints. Another thing that they want to add support for soon, but no support right now. So those are the kinds of things that you're not always going to get in your model when you have them in your database. And then the other thing I said, and this applies to me at least. What question?
I'm sorry, I was going to ask, when you say unique constraints, how would you mean enforcing that, and you would actually persist the object to make sure that it is unique, or?
Right. There's no way to annotate the model in an EF model to say that there's a unique constraint on this entity that these values have to be unique. The database can still have that, and in fact, you can keep your unique constraint in the database, and when you're trying to use Entity Framework and try to save, if you violate the entity constraint, it'll fail, but it's just that information is not actually captured in your model. It doesn't come back into Entity Framework. And I'm not even sure how.
I guess what I'm asking is, assuming that they were able to do that, how would that benefit them? How would they be able to enforce? I mean, I'm assuming they would advocate it to enforce it, right? Or am I wrong?
I think the way that they mostly want to support it for now is for people that are not doing database first. I think that's their first plan, is to add it. So for people that are doing model first, you can, in your model, say, hey, here's a unique constraint, and then when it generates the database, it'll carry through. Right now, today, if you want to have a unique constraint, you got to do it yourself manually. You can't capture it in your model. Right. It probably isn't as useful a feature when you're doing database first anyway, but I was trying to give examples of things. There is a mismatch, right? There's stuff that exists in the database that doesn't exist in the model, and probably vice versa as well. And then the other thing I was going to say, this applies to me especially, is that I don't really like to work with the database right off the bat. In fact, I'd kind of prefer not to have to work with the database at all, which is one of the reasons I like worms. So I prefer to work in code, or at least in a model, something a little more abstract than getting down to the nitty-gritty of indexes and primary keys and so on and so forth. So for me, I would prefer not to have to deal with the database right up front. The model first approach is kind of a hybrid. What it allows you to do is there's a modeler inside Visual Studio, which you guys will see later, lets you do, basically it looks like you're drawing database diagrams, but instead of being a database, it's an entity model, right? So you create that in there, and then from that, you can generate both your code, your objects that you're going to use in code, and your database. And that's the approach that we're using at SRS. And there's some good things about it. The good thing is that you still kind of have that visual diagram, and a lot of people, and I think Rick is my colleague back there, and I think Rick's one that you would agree, right? You really like having a visual diagram. It's like an entity relationship diagram. And a lot of people like it, and we use it a lot. I mean, it's useful. We print out pieces of it, and it's a good way to think about the data in the system. And then the other thing is that it's a kind of a nice middle ground where you can, you don't lose as much on either side. You get most of the database stuff that you want, and what you don't get automatically, you can still manually create, like my example of a unique constraint. You can still apply a unique constraint, you just can't capture it in your model. And then your code is the same way. It generates objects, and that's a customizable process that lets you tweak your objects if you like. So then, of course, negatives are you have to tweak it. If you want, we've found lots of places where we have to tweak that model. It's pretty rich, but
What kind of tweaks are you doing? Are you putting like attributes in your code, or you're actually doing pure coding on top?
If you don't mind, I'll defer because I'm going to be covering that later. And I'd rather be able to go in more detail when I'm actually looking at code, and I can give you more concrete examples. So, but I will. Don't let me forget. I'm sure I'll get to that question. But yeah, there's definitely some places where this model first process has to be tweaked, and that's what the second thing too. Workarounds are necessary. Code first is kind of the. Oops, another question.
That's okay. I was just going to ask. One of the big things I worked with the first version of EF, and there was this big feature, supposedly NV splitting and those kinds of concepts, or where you take one table and maybe make it two. Is that something that, and this would just be a short answer, I guess, is that something that you're doing, or are you just mapping one-to-one from table to entity? Because I'm curious to see which way most people are doing that.
Yeah, what we're using is inheritance, and I think that's kind of what you're talking about. Is that what you mean? Or you can do mapping. You can do mapping where one entity actually comes from two physical tables, but since we kind of started with the entity model from the start, that doesn't make a lot of sense for us. I think that would definitely make sense probably more like in a legacy or database first.
I'm trying to get at, because I've read some places where people go, oh, that's an anti-pattern, you should never be modeling right after the database. And I'm like, really? I'm like, I'd like to keep it one-to-one, but I was just curious if you have an opinion on that, especially if you can start up front. With a clean design. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think I would purposely design that into the system because I don't know why. I mean, what's the difference between that and one-to-one? If it's one-to-one, why not just put it in one entity, to start with? Why split it? But I could definitely see that if I was working with a legacy system and I didn't agree with the way they designed it and they had something split into two that I thought really should be one. And I know that can be done. Don't have much experience with it though, so can't tell you whether it works or not. I bet it would be problematic. My guess would be yeah. Just with my other experiences, I have a feeling that, and I know they say it'll do that, but I bet that has problems. No issues, inserts, updates. Okay, inheritance is a different story, and we're using inheritance quite a bit, and I'll be talking about that and show you some examples of inheritance. So I think that's different because that's more. I think that's more of a. It's more baked in right at the lowest level. To do the thing where you just have two entities or two database tables that get mapped into a single entity, not using inheritance, you have to really pull tricks with the mapping section of the model. I don't know if that means anything to you, but you can do it. But I don't know. Right. Well, it depends on which of these methods you take. In the model first scenario that I talked about second, you create a model and it generates a database. So yes, it does the mapping. In the database first, you have a database and that basically gets transformed into a model. So I think the answer is yes. No, there's only one database you can use with EF. Although, did anybody see? That's right. Oracle, they just came out with an Oracle driver for EF. So.
And they've got third parties. If you're not going 4.1 or the latest, they actually have more expanded version of drivers just catching up.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even think you can use access. Sorry to rain on anybody's parade.
You can't use it with MySQL.
Oh, no kidding.
Notepad of databases.
MySQL works actually very well. I was expecting it. I was like, there's a lot of this. There's a link query. What's going to happen? But it's very good.
Boy, good luck with that. Because the reason I say that is, I mean, I don't know if you've gotten into very extensive like object graphs yet, where you have like a lot of include statements, because it generates some really super SQL Server dependent SQL. I can't picture that working with MySQL, or at least I thought it looked like it was very SQL Server dependent. I've never tested it on MySQL, but you know, I mean, yeah. Anyway, I'll show you guys some of that SQL before the night's over. Somebody else have a question?
One of the gotchas that we found, maybe, I don't know if you've run into this, probably not if you weren't doing database first, but we had a dependency where many-to-many relationships, the joining table had to have a separate primary key for synchronization purposes, like such as replication or sync services or whatever. And Entity Framework won't map that as a many-to-many relationship if it has anything outside of just the two foreign keys.
Oh, yeah. No, that's not an issue anymore. That's definitely gone away. Yeah, I tested that very specifically. What I see often is the many-to-many table has extra data in it, right, where that relationship in itself is an entity, and so there's data in there, and so it exists basically independently, even though it's also it is a many-to-many.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was saying though. If you only had the extra key, it's like they want you to map that to something, and there's nothing to map it to. And so it won't, because like if you just have a joining table with just the two foreign keys, it doesn't actually create an entity for it, because you know it's just got the navigation properties. And I haven't figured out a way for it to do that with that extra key in there.
Right. No, it definitely can handle that, and I've tested that in our architecture. I do seem to remember having to change the model a little bit, though. I don't think it was, probably you couldn't just suck one straight in from a database and have that work. I think you would have to probably change your mapping in your model a little bit. Was there another hand? Did I get everybody? Okay. So I was on to code first. This one is the newest thing, and this is probably what they've been putting most of their effort to in 4.1. Really, I think code first was by far the thing that they put more effort into than anything else. The idea with code first is that you don't do a model in a designer, you don't have an entity relationship diagram anywhere, and you also don't have a database design. You just write C# classes or VB.NET classes, and with some exceptions where you have to kind of mark them up a little bit. You're able to take those C# classes and directly translate them into both an EF model and a database. You know, I have to admit I'm not very experienced with this one yet, because it's fairly new. That it's only just now, I think, really becoming viable, and we had already chosen to go model first. So if you have any hardcore questions on code first, I'm probably not the right person to ask. But I do think it has some nice things about it, and I think the best thing going forward is it's just simple. You know, if your app is very simple and you don't have a ton of entities, and you really just want to knock something out, code first is pretty sweet. And if you look at the examples that they have in the various MSDN places, you know, it's cool. I mean, you just write simple classes and say go, and it pretty much works. So the cons to it, to me, is one, I mean, I think for our system that we've worked on, we would miss having that model, because we use that diagram. It's nice to have that, you know, boxes and lines diagram that shows all your relationships. And then the second thing is that some of the stuff, you know, they say you can just write code and it'll go straight to a database. And that's true, kind of, but some of the things like links, like enforcing the links on text fields, for example, you know, an object in C# or VB has only got a string. It doesn't say how long that thing can be. So they have attributes that you can apply to your classes. You can mark up your classes with attributes that give hints to it as it's creating a database. And that stuff works, but if you ask me, that's kind of like, those things should be split. You know, the whole point of having entities is I want this stuff separated from my persistence concerns. And when you've got attributes right there in your entities that say, hey, this thing needs to be 50 characters long, I mean, you could make an argument, but it feels a little tacked on to me. So, you know, I think it's an interesting approach, and I think it's got potential, especially in simple solutions, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to, you know, give up my model yet. Whoops. So that's it for my PowerPoint. Until later. So I thought what I'd do is now do some demoing. And I'm going to start with a real simple one. So, and I could start this from scratch, but I think just to save time, I'll start with one I've already kind of coded. So I came in and I created a new solution. I right-clicked on it and I said add existing or new item, and I chose ADO.NET Entity Data Model. And before I did this, I installed the 4.1, right? It's a simple download. It's only a couple, like 100 meg or something, and it downloads quick and installs. But you don't have to do that. 4.0 is part of Visual Studio 2010. So if you have 2010, you've already got 4.0. So I choose Entity Data Model. I'm not going to go through with it now, but this is the one it put in there for me. And that's the thing you can open and you get your little boxes and lines diagram. So you guys haven't seen this at all, right? So I will talk a little bit about what it is. The boxes are entities, right? And entities are eventually going to translate directly to our domain classes. The lines in between are our relationships, right? You can see there's a one-to-many between person and address, and a one-to-many between person and phone. Can everybody read that pretty well? Back row, you can read it. A couple of things to point out. When I added these properties, let me add a property here. I'm going to add a scalar property. We're going to call it age. And I'm going to go over to the property window. You got quite a few things you can set on properties. Right, for this one I'm going to say that it's data type first. Instead of being a string, we're going to make it an integer. And, I don't know how much detail I want to get into on all this other stuff, but suffice to say there's a lot of properties you can set for each entity. I do want this to be nullable because some of my code's going to break if I don't make it nullable. So that's how you add properties, right? So you can add as many properties as you want. Then if you want to add associations between entities, I'm going to delete this one that I've already got and re-add it. So if I want to create a join or a foreign key kind of thing between two entities, I right-click on the design surface, I say add, and I say association. Then I choose my one end is going to be person, the other end is going to be address, which it so happens it already picked for me. I say that the person is going to be the one side, the multiplicity is going to be the many side. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. So the next thing is this navigation property, which is interesting. So what navigation properties are is like in your classes. Remember, this is all eventually going to go to classes that we can use in our app. And if I have a navigation property there, it basically is like a shortcut to give me a shortcut over to that sort of associated entity. So in the case of address, since it's one to many, there's multiple addresses for one person. There's like a navigation property there called addresses. Notice how it automatically pluralized it for me. And it's a collection, right? In this case, it's going to be a collection of addresses because you can have multiples. On the other side over here, if I leave this navigation property in, it's a singular because there's not going to be multiple people. There's only going to be one. And so that navigation property is not a collection. It's just a single person. Okay. Now, for me, I don't find it as useful to be able to walk. I think the way with the requirements that I just made up in my head for this application, I don't need to be able to walk back to the person from the address. I just need to be able to get to the addresses from the person. So I'm going to turn this one off. And that takes me to the next thing, foreign key properties, which is a new feature in EF4. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, when they didn't have it, it was ugly. So the idea with a foreign key property, you guys have probably seen it before. You got your person table, you got your address table, and one of the columns in there is person ID, right? And that's your link back to the person table. And so a foreign key property is basically saying I want that's going to be there either way, but if I have this foreign key property thing checked, it's going to make a property in the entity that I can actually see and set and get to. If I turn this off, it still has a property for that, but it hides it from me, and I can't use it myself. So this is, and everyone in here was groaning that tried to use it without it. It's really a pain if you don't have foreign keys. And in fact, really, they probably shouldn't even give you the option. You should just always use them. Yeah, I mean, you can get by without it sometimes, because and you'll see when we look at some of the code, you can, if you add an address to the addresses collection of a person, it's going to automatically do that relationship for me, so I don't have to set the value on that foreign key property. But there's a lot of scenarios in code where it's very useful to be able to set that thing directly. I mean, there's all kinds of UIs, and there's different ways that, I mean, if you're doing something where you're moving a thing around that might be, you have a, one address might be associated with a bunch of different people, and you want to be able into a UI, move it around, being able to set that foreign key property value is it's very useful. So that's why they added it. That was one of the things that made the first version of any framework unusable. So I'm going to say, okay, because I think I got everything set here, and it's going to create a relationship for me. So that's good. Now I'm going to go to properties, because there's something I want to do with this one. I want to say, when someone deletes a person, I want to cascade. So this is a case where we're able to capture something in this model that the code doesn't really care about, right? The objects, there's no cascade delete in your objects, but it is useful in a database. So this is a place where the model will let us capture some information here that, is useful on that end, even though we don't really need it in code. And that's where, I think I mentioned in my talk about model first, is it's the best of both worlds. You can capture information that's only relevant in the data storage side, and there's also some information that's relevant in the object side.
So if you put that cascade on, is it going to change the strategy for when it does a delete, as far as, hey, I know Cascade's going to apply here, so I'm not going to bother to delete all that from the point of view?
Good question. I don't know. I think it depends on what kind of object you're using. Self-tracking entities aren't smart enough. They'd go ahead and mark them all deleted, even though they're going to get cascaded. Yeah, but I think the generated the old style entities, if you will, I think they might be smart enough, but I'm not positive. So I'm not sure which, but I know it's going to put it in the database. The most important thing is it's going to put a cascade delete constraint in the database for us, because we put that in the model. So I'm done with that. I'm going to save the model. I mean, there's a lot of little feature-y stuff in here that, and one of the things that they're actually actively working on, I was just exchanging emails the other day with the team that's working on this designer, and they've got some really cool enhancements coming out for people that have been working with it. But you guys, do you work with it since you're doing database first? Do you ever get in this modeler? Yeah? Yeah, I get it. So they're coming out with like color coding. So you can color code groups of entities. For like us, for our models, it's huge. It's got hundreds of tables, and you can't. It's all a big mess. So you're gonna be able to color code them. It's gonna let you split a model into multiple diagrams, which is really useful, because right now it's one honking big diagram, and it takes a long time to load, and it's slow and cumbersome. So they're gonna let you it's one model, but split into multiple diagrams. Right, Yeah, I wonder if I should do one of those.
I have this problem where I would delete a table on there, because I guess I was trying to delete it. I don't even want to manually add that prompt, just go refresh it, or, I can't remember the situation. Bottom line is I deleted an entity, like address, and then when I went to update the model for the database, it's like it remembered, and it wouldn't let me add it back in. Are you running?
No, I haven't run into that bug. It's crashed on me. That's the main bugs I've run into, is it just crashes Visual Studio, and it does that fairly frequently. You crashed it lately, Rick? Maybe it has gotten better. It used to crash pretty frequently. We use our app uses WPF for the UI, and WPF XAML editor crashes Visual Studio like every 10 minutes, man. That thing crashes all the time. Jeez. So yeah, so this is rock solid compared to that. But yeah, it especially maybe when they first came out with 4. Maybe it was even when it was still previewed, it was pretty buggy and crashed a lot. But yeah, I haven't seen too many other bugs. But it is lacking. I was talking earlier about using Irwin or something like that, and Irwin has tons of features to help you manage big models that this doesn't yet. But they are working on it, and it seems like actively they're saying they're going to come out pretty soon with some good enhancements. So I have now created my model. From here, what I can do is I right-click on the design surface, and I'm going to say generate database from model. Right? You see here's this update model from database. That's if you're doing database first. So I'm not going to demo. I'm sticking with what I know, so I'm demoing model first for the most part because I'm afraid I would break it if I did something different. So I'm going to say generate database from model. And you see the first thing it does is it spits out a big SQL script. So when I say finish here, it makes as part of my project, there's a SQL script. And it's named the name of the model.sql, efdemomodel.edmx.sql. So we keep this in our project. We keep this. This is a major artifact for us. This is what we use when we need to create a new database, right? So this is our starting point anyway. We also have other scripts that we have to manage. I talked earlier about unique constraints as a good example. Indexes. So sometimes there's not a good way in EF in the model to say, hey, I want to index these columns. It just doesn't do that. It automatically puts foreign key indexes. It automatically puts primary key indexes. But if you want to search on name, there's no way to annotate that in the EF model. So we have separate scripts that we maintain as part of our solution that do things like that, right? And I'm not going to bother generating a database now because I've already got one. But what I am going to do is go over to it and delete everything out of it. This will test my Cascade here. I didn't have anything in it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and run a query here just to demonstrate that there's no data in the database, right? Can you guys all read that? Do I need to beef up the size on that any? Can everybody see what that's saying? All right. So back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to go to my code. So the first thing I was going to show is just simply how you do a create to add rows to the database, basically. Oh, wait a minute. First thing I should have showed was generating entities. So after I did my model, I got my model all the way I wanted it. What I needed to do was come in here and say, you right-click and you say Add Code Generation Item. So this is where you set up how you tell EF how to actually create the entities for your project. So if we were doing code first, we wouldn't do this because the code first we create the classes first. But since we're doing model first, we're gonna add a generator. And so it gives us a couple of choices here. This dbContext generator is a new feature, a new type of context that came out of 4.1. So if anybody hasn't gone to 4.1 yet, that's kind of a new thing. It's a wrap around the old object context. And in fact, the old object context still exists. It's wrapped by this dbContext. It's just kind of a simplification, really. So that's one. So if we choose this is sort of like their latest and greatest, and this is designed for non-disconnected scenarios. In other words, it's not for like a service-oriented or in-tier scenario. It's for something that you might use like in a web application or an ASP.NET application where you're going to directly access the database from the web app, and you're not going to make calls out to a separate service. This entity object generator is the old school. That's like the 1.0 version of entity framework. And so I'm not even going to talk about that. And then self-tracking entities is where we'll get towards the end of this talk. Self-tracking entities is the one that they've done for disconnected scenarios for service-oriented. But for now, for this demo, because I wanted to keep it simple, I chose the dbContext generator. And what that did is it actually added two items to my solution. One is this .context, entity generator.context.tt, and the other one is just entity generator.tt. Anybody in here have experience with TT templates? You know what I'm talking about when I say that? TT templates is a Microsoft tool for doing code generation, basically. Anybody worked with Wright or, you've used code generation tools before. TT is just the Microsoft version. I'll show you like what it looks like. It actually looks like ASP is what it looks like. Here, I'll show you. Like old school ASP. You see how it has these like angle brackets with it's totally, so like the stuff that's inside those angle brackets is just going to get pretty much spit out spit out directly, and then you can use C# code. I'm showing here. So, there's like if statements, you can do loops and so on outside the angle brackets, and what's inside the angle brackets is going to get spit out. I mean, it's pretty simple template-based code generation kind of technology. But it's pretty powerful and pretty flexible. You can write functions in it. It is C#. I don't think you can use VB.NET. I think you have to know C# really to use it. But I think it's kind of important to know that this is happening because I haven't managed to get very far with EF without having to tweak the TT templates that it comes with. We weren't able to use them right out of the box for much of anything, really. So it's important to, you are going to probably have to know that you're going to have to learn this technology, and you're probably going to have to manage TT templates. You have your eyebrows creased. You managed to escape so far? Tons. Once again, if you don't mind, I'll defer because I'll show them later. But especially with self-tracking entities, we had tons. We still tweak them constantly. And some of it wasn't even bad. It's useful because, so let me say this generator is going to generate your domain objects that you're going to use. So some of the stuff we added to the TT templates is not even because of an EF shortcoming, it's just because we wanted some convenient stuff in our classes. Like for instance, we wanted them to be able to copy themselves, including like a deep copy where they would copy, sub-objects that live in their graph. And so we added that functionality to the TT, and it just gets generated, and we don't have to write it because it's just boilerplate code anyway. And there might have been some other stuff like that too. We added some events. We added some like before update event and stuff like that don't necessarily. It's not because something's broken. It was just useful.
So if you were to regenerate this, then because I'm assuming if you're coming in here and you're modifying it, then what would happen if is it going to wipe it out?
Absolutely. When you make changes to the TT and you save them, it reruns. It runs right then when you save it. And so anything that's underneath that, gone.
But if you were to regenerate that TT, you would lose whatever changes you made and start from scratch again? Or I guess, never mind, you did it. You have to tell it to do it. Okay. It's not happening right away.
No, but you did just generate your, from the model, you said build code item, then it really built a new updated TT file.
Yeah, what it really does is it just adds this TT file to your project, and it runs it at the same time when you add it, I think. But if I look, see here, I'm back to my Solution Explorer, and here's the TT, and if I expand it, underneath here is the stuff that got generated by that particular TT template. Here's the one that has the entities in it, entity generator. So you see there's my address, my person, and my phone. So I can easily, so the thing is, I can go into like address, I can open this entity, and I could go in here and make changes to it, and everything would run just fine, but the next time I generate, anything I did is gone. So you got to be real careful with them. We don't make changes to the entities, right, because they're generated, so you can use partial classes, and if you notice they're declared as a partial class. And we have a separate business logic class that has all the code that we write for entities, any behavior or anything that we do for our entities. I'm not sure I understood you.
Sorry, you can use a metadata class. The same class with the .metadata name is often used with the attributes and a lot of the extra logic, and that's not done with the code generation. It's all separate.
We did some. I think we kind of did the same thing, but we called it business logic. So is there already a metadata class somewhere?
Primarily used for like NBC stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen it done much in desktop applications.
Yeah, I think even like XAML does the same thing. Doesn't XAML have a metadata file? There's like 3 files associated with any like WPF, and I think one of them's a metadata.
Every entity class can have a metadata class, .metadata, and then that's the other side of this partial class. You can put your attributes on it, so you can use that for like validation, range checking, anything you want to, and it's a database level validation.
I totally missed that. I don't know if that doesn't apply.
RIA service is a more specific kind of thing. You see that in RIA services. And I haven't used it as much as a straight database.
Right. The other thing is I suspect that is not present in self-tracking entities. I think that is not available in a self-tracking entity. But yeah, I'm not even really familiar with that. So maybe it is, and I just missed it. So I don't think we did do iClonable. We do. I think we created our own interface that has a real copy with generics instead of iClonable. I think, you know, though I do think I think ours have a clone method just because it was easy to stick in there. It just calls the same copy that we created. The copy was kind of interesting though because it has to cycle through child collections and stuff, and that's all very doable with that TT logic. You know, there's ways it knows all about the metadata of your classes, so you can cycle through it. One issue I have though a lot and still have when I'm customizing TTs is there's no documentation at all for any of the EF stuff. You know, it's like it's all there. Everything you could want to know is right there, but there's no documentation anywhere, and you have to reflect a lot. I mean, I've used a lot of reflector to find out, you know, what was available to me in the TT. Oh yeah, that's another good point. TTs are a pain in the butt to edit. You know, when I showed that thing, you know, it's really hard because these stupid little angle brackets. You know, the stuff that's between the angle brackets is what you care about a lot of times, and you can't really tell what it is, so it's easy to get lost. And so, yeah, color coding. There are some add-ins to Visual Studio that try to make TT editing easier, and we tried a couple of them, and one of them was really good, but it was super buggy and crashed VS all the time, so we ditched it. And that's the one we used. Is it better now?
It seems to me it's been pretty solid.
So I haven't tried it for probably 6 to 8 months. But man, last fall, I was doing a lot of TT editing last fall, and it was just killing me. It crashed all the time. Yeah, that's the same one, tangible. You would think Microsoft would come out with one. That seems like a no-brainer. But I haven't heard anything about that happening. So, I think I covered the TT part of it, the generation part of it fairly well. Let's look at an entity here. This is the address entity that we had. And see, this is one of the things I like about EF. I mean, that's dead simple, right? I mean, that's pretty much like the easiest implementation of that entity that I coded in as you could get. And it's very readable, and a lot of times generated code's ugly and kind of hard to read, but I think that the EF does a pretty good job. The templates that they have provided do a pretty good job of giving you readable code. All right. So now I'm going to go back and actually use some of this stuff. How do you take a break, Alan? Should I just talk until everyone boos me off the stage, or?
Yeah, we'll take a break at 60 minutes.
Okay.
A few minutes before. We're at 50 right now.
Okay. All right. So 10 minutes, and then there's only like a half an hour after that, right? So I need to get moving, basically.
Yeah, I know we're long to change the table. So.
Okay. All right. Part 2. All right. So that's cool because I can cover this stuff pretty quickly. So the first thing in this is code that's going to illustrate how to create rows in the database. And the first thing it does is it creates this context guy, right? And this guy is really important, especially in non-self-tracking entities EF code. That class, EF demo model, was the thing that got generated by that context TT. There were 2 TTs. Remember, one generates the entities, the other one generates this context class. So you end up using that sucker all over the place. So you'll see, I go in here and this code to create a new person is standard C# object creation code. There's nothing EF specific to that. But down at the end here, I call context.people.add, right? So that's where I'm telling EF, hey, the fact that I'm calling add is telling EF that this row needs to be an add in the database, right? So I created several people here. And this all pretty much the same code. And then at the end, I call context.saveChanges, and that's what's actually going to apply it. So that there's a couple of important things to note there. During the time until you call save changes on the context, everything that you've told that context to do, add, remove, update, retrieve, is all being stored, right? It keeps track of that. It keeps state on all the entities that you have retrieved or modified. So when you call save changes, everything you've told us to do gets applied. There is a transaction at that point. When you call save changes, everything that happens there happens inside a database transaction. So one fails, they all fail. The fact that it saves all that state is useful and also kind of a curse sometimes. Rick was running into a problem with that today. The fact that context is holding the state, if you go into a loop and do 30,000 or 50,000 adds, and then call context save. Well, first of all, while you're in that loop and you're saying add, the context is storing all the data for all those objects. So if you also had them in your own data structure before you started going into your loop and calling context.add, they're in memory twice. And actually, it stores quite a bit more than just the entity because it stores a bunch of ancillary data. I think it's almost, well, it depends on the size of the entity, but it's pretty big. I mean, it stores like a lot of stuff. It stores a key, it stores a state, it stores, when the last time it was retrieved, it stores, some concurrency information. So what it stores for every entity that you have told it to do something with is substantial. And if you're doing a big process that's loading that sucker up with a bunch of data, you're going to have memory issues. So we've run into those. But in this case, I'm only doing 5, so it's not a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, so I have some data to query against. Oh, great. You know what, I bet it's that property I added. You know why? Because I didn't add that column to the database. Here's where we get to see how good the error reporting is. Oh, invalid column name, age. What a shock. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my script. Here's my connection tool. So that basically just completely recreated that database, all the tables and everything in that database. Now I'm going to run again.
It seems scripted with
Yeah, it's smart enough to drop stuff that already exists. Well, great. It didn't work that well. Shouldn't have to recompile, I don't think. Well, it still says invalid column name age. That's interesting. Oh, you know what? I'm not sure that I regenerated that SQL after I added the column. I might have regenerated the SQL before. Let's see. No, it's in there. Huh. It's connected to EF demo. But the message I was getting was saying invalid age. Oh, I sure do, don't I? That was because I dropped that, deleted that one. This is what I get for messing with my already working demo. And I really want to get this to work. Yeah. I think I got it to go that time. I made it nullable, remember? I did that on purpose because I knew I was going to have... Okay, so now I have data. So that's how you create. Now let's look at how you update or query, because that's really the coolest thing about Entity Framework. The reason that I haven't ditched it, even though all the trouble it's caused, is because of the querying. So I want to show. I got several good examples here, I think. So this is my query people. You use link, right? It's got a thing called link to entity. And so in this first example here, names with Joe. I mean, that's pretty darn readable, right? And it's C# code. You don't have to, there's no SQL anywhere. Let me say that again. No SQL anywhere. You know what it does? I mean, there is SQL. What it does is it generates the SQL at runtime, and from this link query, it's able to create SQL, and it's pretty darn flexible. Anything that works with link will work with this. Although sometimes it's not. It can't translate everything in direct SQL. Sometimes it does half of it as SQL and then brings all the data back and does the rest of it with regular old link. So it doesn't always perform like you think it's going to. You have to be kind of careful. And to that effect, I thought I could run a trace here and show some of the SQL that actually is going to get generated. Start. There we go. That's what I want to do. So I just started a new SQL trace, right? And let me set a breakpoint right here. Everybody know link pretty well. Do I need to explain what this is doing? Is that pretty clear? And we're going to look for context.people. We're looking for everybody whose name contains Joe. And there's actually two because somebody's name was Jones. So there's going to be 2 people come back. So I'm going to, oops, I got to go up and comment. All right, so names with Joe has already run. And in fact, if we look, if we inspect it, we'll see, oh, it only brought 1 guy back. Maybe I changed the name. But Joe Smith came back. So we know that worked. Now we're going to go over and look at the SQL that got generated. And if we look, it's pretty simple, really. Whoops, that's not the one. Or is it? No, this is one that was actually trying to directly retrieve a... There's the one I wanted. No. This is the one I wanted. There we go, like Joe. So it puts a lot of extents in and renames a lot of stuff, and sometimes these SQL statements are hard to read. But if you look at that statement and read it, it's actually going to perform just fine, right? I don't think that, I mean, that'll perform as good as any hand-coded SQL will perform. No, and the reason it's bringing all the data back is because it's going to hydrate those entities, right? So in simple cases especially, and even in medium complex cases, it produces pretty good SQL, and you can read it. It's, you know, it's not totally like it would be if you wrote it. Are we out of time? Okay, so let's take a short break. So before I get started again, I didn't do a lot of preparation for this, but I did find a joke that I want to tell. So a quick developer humor. So there's a programmer, a manager, and a hardware engineer going to see a client. They fly into the airport and land, and then they rent a car and they have to drive up over a mountain and down on the other side into the town where their client is. So they get to the top of the mountain, no problems. Just as they start to head down, the brakes go out in the car. They careen wildly out of control around a couple of corners, almost crash. Finally, they end up going through a guardrail and heading straight down the side of the mountain. But luckily, there's like a flat patch with some brush or some trees, little small trees that manage to stop the car. And they stop like teetering over the edge of a 1,000-foot cliff. So after they catch their breath, the manager says, I know what we need to do here in order to finish the journey. We need to first get some goals together, and then we need to have a vision statement as to how we're going to get to the client, and then we need to have a few committee meetings to decide the best way to approach it, and then we need a project plan, and then we'll implement it. The hardware engineer says, you're full of it. That's way too hard. I got a Swiss Army knife right here. I can strip the brake line and fix the brakes, and we'll be on our way in no time flat. The programmer says, well, wait a second, both of you guys are out of line. The first thing we have to do is go back up top and see if we can make it happen again. All right, so we showed, I won't go too much farther into this query, but one thing I did want to demonstrate was this last query here is doing a group by. And link group bys are kind of cool anyway. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to work with group by and link. It's not quite the same as SQL, right? It's not a flat output. It brings back the keys, and then it brings back the whole list of stuff in for each individual key. So that's kind of cool in and of itself. But then the other thing is I wanted to illustrate the SQL, some of the downfalls, right, of the SQL that comes out of Entity Framework. So this last query right here, what it attempts to do is to get everybody that has the same zip code, and it does, if you notice, it returns an anonymous type too. It's not returning an entity, it's returning an anonymous type that's just the name and the first phone number's number for each person. So I'm going to go ahead and let it run through to that. And now let's go over and look at the SQL that got cranked for that last one. Hopefully this is it. Yep, this is it. This is the kind of thing you should get used to if you're going to work with Entity Framework. Very long SQL statements. We had one, 5,000 characters, is that right, Rick? It was like 10 printed pages of SQL statement. It's not quite as bad as you think, but it's bad. It performs pretty crappy. And the worst part of it is if you look down here, I don't have to go too far down, and that right there. Real easy to get outer joins, man. In fact, they're pretty much impossible to avoid. If you start querying on subtables, if you're doing, a graph kind of situation, which is very common, outer joins all over the place. And if you have, like what we have is some really big, we're using sort of like domain-driven design principles. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but in domain-driven design, a lot of times you have what they call aggregates, which are like, you know, an object that has a big graph underneath it, right? It'd be like our for an insurance policy, it'd be like your policy holder might be an aggregate, right? And so that guy's got all kinds of stuff underneath him. He's got his policies that he owns, and he's got his agents, and he's got, you know, probably expiration dates and premium schedules and payments that came in, and, you know, just it's a big graph, right? And so we have those. When you retrieve a big graph like that from Entity Framework, it gets out of hand very quick, and it doesn't perform very well. And in fact, we've even had to tweak the way Entity Framework works. And now I wish I could remember where we did that. It wasn't in a TT template. I think it was by actually, dang. Have you looked at where Mark did that, Rick, where he had to make those changes to, crap. That's one of the things I should have asked. Mark Schiffer is the one that did this particular thing I'm talking about, and I can't remember where he had to do it. But he had to basically intercept the SQL query that was about to go out to SQL Server, because it was like this times 10, and replace it with our own like individual, where instead of doing all these outer joins, we did multiple queries, right? We sent off multiple queries to the database. So that's definitely something to watch out for with big graphs. Anyway, so then I don't want to spend a whole lot more time on this thing, but we've already, during the break, we talked about too, I'm not going to be able to get everything I had in, so my plan here is to just kind of finish looking at these basic scenarios, and then talk a little bit about an intro to self-tracking entities, and then I'm going to have to come back again and talk in more detail about what we're actually doing in our some of the problems we've had. So, but let me show some of the code. I don't even think I'll run it. But here's how you do updates. Okay, so the first thing I do is a query that's very similar to those queries I was doing up above, right? I'm just finding everybody that has the zip code of 62704. And then I'm just going into a loop on each one, and I'm changing the zip code. This is a simple example. And then I'm calling context.savechanges. Now this might, darn it. Man, I don't know how to not talk about all this. You might be interested to know, so when I call context.savechanges here, how does it know? Because if you notice, I didn't tell the context anything about to apply those changes or let it know that I was making those changes. I mean, right here, I'm just changing the property on the object, and somehow the context is finding out about it. And if you remember when we looked at those entities, they're dead simple, right? There's no code in there that's telling Entity Framework anything's going on. So let's look. Let me set a breakpoint right here. And let's figure out why that's happening the way it's happening. What just happened to me? So from 04 is the query that I just ran, right? And I'm actually going to go down in here to, I'm going to step through, because just like other link stuff, right? From 04 in this code, whoops, did I do that? Can I minimize, or?
Give it just a second.
Okay, maybe I can just flip back over.
Yeah, it canceled it for some reason, but you'll have to hit that record button again.
So just like I've seen in other, just like you have seen in other link stuff, from 04 is a query, right? It's not actually resolved at this point. So I'm going to step into the code so it actually resolves it. When I just did that, now it's actually executed. Now let's look at person that got returned. Oh, look at that. It's not our entity. It's a system.data.entity.dynamicproxies.person_a So there's some magic happening there, right? When we do queries using this mode of Entity Framework, which is when we use when I chose to generate the entities. Remember, I chose that dbContext deal. It's not returning the actual entity to me. It's running a proxy. It's returning a proxy, and really what it's done is it's just inherited from my class, from my entity that I see, and wrapped it with some persistence-aware stuff. So that's what allows it when I make changes to the zip code. There's code in that proxy that knows to say, hey, Entity Framework, something changed. So be aware of that. But there's another consequence to that that's really important, and that's the fact that this guy has to be alive while that's happening. If that context is not around, if he goes out of scope while I'm making these changes, then the changes have nobody to talk to, right? So that's a big issue with if you're using Entity Framework this way, if you're using it with the dbContext, do you think I can go back and start that again? So now, record.
And say okay. But it's those hotkeys.
If you're using Entity Framework with the dbContext style, then you've always got to keep your context that you create around while you're doing operations, so you can then call save on it. And what you can't, another thing you can't do is you can't like create a context, do some retrieves from it, and then make some changes, and then save it to another call to another context to save changes. You can't do that. It has to be to the one that retrieved the objects. So it's a little bit ugly, right? It's really ugly when you get into a disconnected scenario, right, where you have services and you're crossing service boundaries. You can't do that. You can't leave a context sitting around in RAM. Plus, remember what I said earlier about how those things keep all the state in them? So, so you can see where that starts to get ugly too. So this guy's got, that context has got to be alive the whole time I'm doing any kind of database operations, and then save them at the end. But he's saving all the state, and he's saving it in kind of a not very conservative way. So that means if if I do a lot of stuff, my RAM just blows up on me. So these are things you have to work around, is all there is to it. If you're going to use this, you got to be aware of the way it works. You got to plan to have a context available at all times if you're using the dbContext style of entities, and you got to understand that there's a RAM issue, and it works if you're kind of careful about how you do that.
Are you planning on in your part 2 then covering more of the job type scenarios then?
Sure.
This sounds great for single record management then, but for large scale type stuff, the things that you successfully apply to.
Absolutely, and I got to admit, we've run into some scenarios lately where we're not able to use Entity Framework in large volume, partly for performance reasons and partly because of memory. Yeah, like one example is a bulk import, like where we were importing from a file with like 50,000 rows and dumping it straight into a database table. No business logic at all. Basically, we're just taking a file, dumping it into a database table. It worked. Entity Framework would do it, but we had RAM issues where it was taking like gigabytes of RAM to do that. And then the other problem was it's slow, really slow. So we just bypassed it. We used SQL bulk load. Did the same job that took I can't even remember what the improvement was, but it was, orders of magnitude faster to use a SQL bulk load. So, that's a message I have too. I think, if you're going to really do a large, robust system, I don't think you're going to be able to use Entity Framework for every piece of data access. That's just my opinion. I showed you that SQL that gets so inefficient, and there's some times when you just can't avoid that. And, I think in those cases, we're actually still kind of trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out what we want to do. Because especially what I don't want to see is I don't want to see SQL embedded in the application, right? And that's the big thing that, that's the biggest win, in my opinion, to going to Entity Framework or any other ORM, is that no SQL in the application. But, how are you going to do that when, you got to use ADO? So we're still struggling with that. So, I could go ahead and let this finish, and we could prove that we got nothing but 62707s over here. Everybody that had 62704, you can see there's two 62704s, and now there's 3 62707. So it did do updates. I'm going to go ahead and show, but not run the code for deletes as well. But it's pretty simple. Kind of same thing. I just went through all the people this time. I didn't even bother doing a link query on people. I just said in context.people, and then I called remove. Remove is the equivalent of the delete. Called remove and then called context.savechanges, and that works. Matt, you brought up something, where I think this dbContext mode of using EF works really well, and is actually like the biggest easy use case where I think EF makes sense is in a simple ASP.NET application. If you already have a situation where your ASP.NET is talking to the database, and you don't mind, you don't need to go through a service, you don't need in-tier, then then I think this mode works great because HTTP methods are already supposed to be short, right? I mean, you don't want to do anything that takes too much RAM. They need to be fairly stateless, so makes it easy to create a context, do whatever work you need to do, call save changes, and let the context go away in the course of one HTTP response. So I think that was part of the reason I wanted to go ahead and show this, even though we're not using it, is because I do think it works really well in that scenario.
In Silverlight, you have to proxy across. Turns out RIA services give you the same entity reflected, or almost the same entity reflected. And then you do encapsulate, hide away your database because it's through a service, but then it wires up the service with lots of shortcuts. So you're not directly building, a full WCS service and doing all the other parts in there. But it looks the same and acts the same.
So does it even allow you to do? The sort of, well, what's the word I'm trying to say? Disconnected then, so it gives you the same entity and allows you to use that entity across a service boundary. And
I have not had it caused to be disconnected. I believe so, but that's not something I could say.
Because my guess is it would have to go something more like self-tracking entities to make that work. It's either got self-tracking entities or...
No, it has self-tracking entities. It has to have,
right.
Because what's happening is Silverlight's keeping the context, they need save changes. It's then sending across just the diffs. Otherwise, it would be horribly efficient on service.
Right, and that's self-tracking entities is what they're for.
When you say disconnected, are you meaning like the traditional briefcase model where you take a data source, come back and stick it back in, or?
No, and I'm sorry, I probably should use a better term for that. What I mean is, you're not directly talking to the database. You're not directly. EF is not able to directly connect to the database from the code that's running. In other words, you can take an entity and pass it to a service, and then the service is going to be able to connect to the database. But a good example would be like in a rich client, where you don't want the rich client to directly talk to the database. It's more of an end-tier situation where the rich client needs to access, pass data to a service, and then the service is the one that's responsible for actually talking to the database. Does that make sense? So end-tier and service, any SOA kind of situation is more what I mean. Yeah, and just since we're all rapping here, I'm starting to kind of get down on the whole end-tier thing, and even SOA a little bit. And I know that's a little heretical, but I'm not sure what it's buying us, especially like the situation we're in. We've got our apps are pretty much internal, and even in a web situation where you got a powerful web server. What do we get when we go end-tier or SOA? I think we just kind of complicate our deployments a lot. We make our lives harder, and what's the payoff?
Generally, it saves money for counts. It looks good on an architect's website.
Well, there you go.
That's really what
I mean. I think you could make some case for scale. Maybe you get a little better scale especially if you're internet. Kind of, if you're Reddit or some kind of huge website kind of thing, but it doesn't help straight line performance, right? It doesn't perform faster to use SOA. You're obviously all that plumbing overhead of communications is slowing you down. So, I don't know. Sorry, that was a little digression, but I think we should. I think as a field, we should really start to question. When we need to distribute. In fact, if you read Martin Fowler, his first law of distributed applications is don't. So, and I think I read that and I was like, oh, he's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And now, it's like, you know what? He had a point there. So, I kind of think our lives would be easier if we weren't so quick to build service boundaries into everything we did. All right, a little digression.
Agile calling gold plating. Do you have a need to do it? No, don't do it.
Yeah.
I can tell you one big advantage that we have for one of our applications is we've got a series of applications that go through servers. We've also got another application that everybody connects directly to the database, kind of like you're talking about. The biggest problem we have there is when we want to update the database schema, we have no way of kicking everybody out of the database to run the updates. So they stay connected, with their old schemas and the clients that connect to the database, and they start failing. So
that's a problem.
That's the one reason we're looking at taking one of our applications over to a server base.
We had to address a similar problem with our service. I don't know that problem changes when you have a service because you still got to be able to shut down your service, right? You got to be able to. Well, I guess you can, but they get goofy error messages, right? I mean, all of a sudden they get this cryptic error message that says the service is not responding. I mean, we built a feature into our app that basically lets us tell the clients, hey, we're shutting down, and then the clients shut off. So, I mean, there are ways to solve that problem. But I hear what you're saying, and that's a good point. I mean, of course, the big thing everyone's going to sell is that, hey, we can build a bunch of different front ends on it, right? We can build a web front end, we can build a GUI, we can build whatever we want. And there's some merit to that. But notice I'm not... Well, I want to emphasize that when I talked about not distributing, what I was not saying is that we should not layer. I do believe in layering, absolutely. What I don't believe in necessarily, or at least not quite so quickly, is to introduce these service boundaries or process boundaries into everything we do. So I see there's 5 minutes left. Should I knock off here, because I know Mark's got something he needs to talk about. I think, is that right? It ends at 9, doesn't it? Yeah. So I guess that seems like a good stopping point. And there's a lot of stuff that I still want to talk about, because the self-tracking stuff I think is what's really probably most useful to a lot of people. But you should have to wait till next time for that.